When it comes to the spiritual realm, modern conversation often fractures into two extremes. On one side, secularism dismisses the supernatural as a psychological glitch. On the other, fringe movements hyper-focus on it, blaming every flat tire or personal setback on a specific territorial spirit. Wayne Grudem's systematic theology cuts right through this noise. He lays out a strictly biblical framework that acknowledges the intense, literal reality of demonic forces without ever surrendering God's absolute structural sovereignty. Systematic theology treats the spiritual realm not as a mystical, unknowable mystery, but as a precise, structured schematic. Understanding the exact theological parameters of the enemy acts as a guardrail. It prevents both paralyzing fear and foolish arrogance. To understand this schematic, we have to start at the foundational bedrock, the exact Greek and Hebrew definitions of the enemy. Take the name Satan. It translates to adversary. Think of him as a negative coefficient in a mathematical equation. His sole operational purpose is to subtract and invert God's positive design. Then there is the Greek term diabolos, or the devil, which means slanderer. Here, he acts as a corrupted data constant, continually injecting false variables to warp human perception of the truth. And when 1 John says the devil sinned from the beginning, the Greek phrase op archais refers specifically to the start of human history, not eternity past. It functions like a y-intercept on a graph, the exact point the downward trend began. Grudem anchors this directly in the Old Testament, noting the Hebrew word used in Job chapter 1 translates squarely as adversary. These definitions clarify a crucial baseline. Demons are not an opposing equal God. They are a mathematical glitch permanently contained within God's closed system. To fully map out Grudem's system, we can extract 13 core conceptual parameters of the spiritual realm. Second, their ontology. Demons are created, non-material beings with high intelligence. They operate essentially as rogue system administrators who possess no physical hardware. Grudem provides a concise definition. Demons are evil angels who sinned against God and who now continually work evil in the world. Second is their origin. This was a military defection. They were prestigious guards who abandoned their assigned posts and subsequently lost all access to the throne. Third, we can pinpoint the exact chronology of this fall. It occurred in a narrow window strictly between Genesis 1:31, when God declared everything very good, and Genesis 3:1, when Satan appears to tempt Eve. Fourth, the nature of that originating sin. Isaiah 14 frames this as a hostile corporate takeover, a subordinate brazenly attempting to seize the CEO's chair. The poetry of Isaiah exposes this hubris. I will ascend to heaven, above the stars of God. I will make myself like the Most High. And the immediate consequence, you are brought down to Sheol. Demonic forces are not eternal rivals to God. They are defeated defectors with a fixed expiration date. This raises a spatial paradox. If these forces were cast into hell, how do they actively influence Earth? Fifth, the parameter of eternal chains, mentioned in Jude and 2 Peter. Think of this using the analogy of inmates on a restricted yard. Grudem parses the text to show these chains are metaphorical. The inmates are permanently removed from the glory of God's presence, but their influence is not removed from the world. Sixth, we have to debunk a persistent mythology regarding Genesis 6, the idea that the sons of God were demons marrying human women. This is a categorical mapping error in a biological dataset. Angels and demons are non-material. As Grudem highlights, citing Jesus in Matthew 22, they lack the physical hardware to intersect with human genetics. Seventh is Satan's position as the head of this hierarchy. He functions like a cartel boss who relies on a vast network of subordinates precisely because he is not omnipresent. Satan cannot be everywhere at once. His entire network relies on localized subordinates who operate strictly within God's highly restricted perimeter. Moving from the structure of this realm, we need to examine their actual tactical operations against humanity. Eighth, Satan acts as patient zero in a cosmic epidemiological model, successfully transmitting moral rebellion to humanity in the garden. 1 John confirms the devil was a murderer from the beginning and the originator of sin before any human took part. Ninth, their primary tactic. 2 Corinthians states they blind the minds of unbelievers. It's a localized solar eclipse. They cannot extinguish the light of the gospel. They can only slide a dark lens over human perception. 10th, absolute divine limitation. The book of Job proves that Satan is a guard dog on a strictly measured leash. He can only do what God explicitly permits. Even in their most destructive, highly targeted attacks, demons are entirely dependent on the sovereign permission of God. This completely neutralizes any biblical justification for sheer panic. So how should the modern church respond to this highly restricted hierarchy? 11th, we must reject the error of theologians like Rudolf Bultmann, who tried to demythologize the New Testament by ignoring the demonic. That is like deleting the engine from a car's blueprint just because you cannot physically see the wind. 12th is the epistolary silence. When the Apostle Paul addresses deep behavioral problems in the early church, he acts like an antivirus overriding bad code, not a user shouting at the screen to delete a hacker. Look at his letters to Corinth. When facing severe sexual immorality or aggressive lawsuits among believers, Paul never commands the church to cast out a spirit of incest or a spirit of litigation. He commands them to exercise church discipline and repent. 13th, the gospel is the primary mechanism of warfare. It functions as a broad-spectrum antibiotic that purges the entire system, rather than trying to diagnose and shout at individual symptoms. Grudem points out a critical fact. No one in the New Testament ever summons a territorial spirit to demand information before proclaiming the truth. The church's primary weapon is not mystical, performative combat. It is the ordinary, unstoppable proclamation of the truth. Let's apply this directly to the modern practice of strategic-level spiritual warfare, where believers attempt to map out and bind specific territorial spirits over their cities. This practice creates a false illusion of control. It establishes a nearly pagan theology where spiritual victory depends on discovering the right names and performing precise rituals. Consider the ancient Church of Corinth. It serves as the ultimate historical test case for a community under severe, coordinated demonic attack. The believers there were engaged in deep sexual immorality, dragging each other into secular courts and fracturing the church into bitter tribal factions. Yet there is a glaring omission in Paul's response to this chaos. At no point does he instruct the elders to identify the local demonic hierarchy, nor does he command them to bind a demon of dissension. If modern strategic mapping were the apostolic standard, Paul committed massive pastoral malpractice. But Paul wasn't negligent. His theology of warfare was simply far deeper. Paul's actual solution to the crisis in Corinth relied entirely on moral accountability, church discipline, genuine outrage at sin, and rigorous self-examination. We have to be careful. Elevating the blame for our own personal sin to the demonic realm is often a subtle way to abdicate human moral responsibility. It is much easier to ask an exorcist to cure a spirit of anger than it is to do the actual grueling and deeply biblical work of repenting of your own unmortified flesh. The most terrifying thing to the demonic realm is not a loud believer shouting at the darkness. It is a Christian quietly, relentlessly pursuing objective truth and personal righteousness. So, where do you see the modern church losing its balance on this issue? Does Grudem's definition change how you view your own struggles with sin? Let me know in the comments. If you want to continue mastering high-level systematic theology without the confusion, subscribe to the channel. Let's keep our theology precise and our victory anchored exactly where it belongs, in the finished work of Jesus.